As Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, it's an attempt to create the impression that your past is a wasteland of non-achievement, that you have no reference to any greatness, to any science. Even as we stood amidst the pyramid, as we stood at the great Zimbabwe monument, as we stood at the remnants of the Benin Kingdom, the first city in the world to have lights, as we stood in the midst of greatness built by our ancestors, knowing that Mansa Musa was the wealthiest man in the world at some stage, they still wanted to persuade you that you have no value, intellectual, physical, or spiritual, that your beliefs are mere fetishes. Before I begin, allow me to acknowledge the historical struggle of the Maroons in Jamaica, the Haitian revolutionaries, our ancestors who perished in their millions in the ocean and in the middle corridors. Let me acknowledge the women of Africa who bravely resisted enslavement, colonization, and apartheid. Allow me to acknowledge the nameless comrades, because Sankara we know, Machel we know, Mandela we know, Sekou Touré we know, but the gallant fight against immiseration, emasculation, dehumanization was carried out by nameless, faceless women for whom this struggle is a redemption song. Wherever they rest, let them hear that their great-grandchildren have a reason to fight on. I want to talk today about chattel enslavement of Africans, colonization and apartheid. And I want to establish continuities that help us understand why this struggle is both about memory and about imagination. This is a recognition of the fact that the transatlantic chattel enslavement of Africans was a crime against humanity, that apartheid was a crime against humanity, and this is recorded in UN resolutions, that colonialism was characterized by a series of genocide. In case you think this is hyperbole, you will know of the genocide against the Herero and the Nama in Namibia. You will know about the genocide against the Khoi and the San. You will know about the genocide in the Congo. Of course, when you raise the question of reparations, there are people within the African community and amongst Afro-descendants and within other racial groupings who say children do not carry the sins of their fathers. As unfortunate and as painful as enslavement was, and colonialism and apartheid were, they happened too long ago to be possible of any rational discourse. These geniuses also tell us that in any event, how would we determine who deserves or is entitled to redress, including citing cases of mixed-race children born to both enslaved and slave-owning parents, and claims that the West was not the only slave-owning civilization, that the West is actually the only civilization that morally abolished slavery. These geniuses also tell us enslavement had nothing to do with race, but economics. Arabs had slaves, Africans had slaves, they say. And in any event, this word slave comes from the word Slavs. And the Slavs were enslaved by Arabs. That blacks and Africans were not only the only enslaved race. So why are you making so much noise? And some have even told us that the censoring reparations denies the agency of Africans, as envisaged by Marcus Garvey, who said we shall redeem ourselves, that the act of self-economic development somehow negates the demand for historical justice. That what Africa and Afro-descendants need is investment and technology transfer, not white charity or payments from the white world. They also tell us that the reparations talk ignores the harm that has been occasioned to Africans by black African leaders. That in any event, that enslavement was legal. So my friends, why would people within enslaved community or descendants of enslaved and colonized people believe in these things? I want you to understand there's 8 cardinal rules that manufacture not slaves, but that might manufacture psychotic and neurotic conditions. That Wilson said of them in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. He said, the Negro will always use the back door. I'm paraphrasing. Why? Because he's been taught that is his place, and he accepts that that is his place. If there is no door, he will cut the door so that he can use the place assigned to him. Number 1, dehumanization through law. The Barbados Slave Code. It said blacks are not fully human, but beasts of burden, savages. As such, their existence is not governed by law, human rights, human dignity, or humanity. So, you can treat them as property, own them, dispose of them. Number 2, natives have no sense of commerce, of ownership, of value, which led to the justification of alienation of our intellectual property, our inventions, our scientific contributions, our land, our tangible and intangible assets. Justification for using pole and hard tax during colonialism in order to force our ancestors who were fairly food self-sufficient and wealthy to work for the plantations and the mines. The spiritualization of white supremacy and enslavement. That blacks are descendants of Ham, who was cursed to be hewers of wood and carriers of water, and therefore they are a people with no real benefit to society. They have no right to comfort, heritage, or legacy. Erasure of history, of images and symbols of past greatness through plunder, falsification, and alienation. That is the erasure of your cultural meaning and identity. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, it's an attempt to create the impression that your past is a wasteland of non-achievement, that you have no reference to any greatness, to any science. Even as we stood amidst the pyramid, as we stood at the great Zimbabwe monument, as we stood at the remnants of the Benin Kingdom, the first city in the world to have lights, as we stood in the midst of greatness built by our ancestors, knowing that Mansa Musa was the wealthiest man in the world at some stage, they still wanted to persuade you that you have no value, intellectual, physical, or spiritual, that your beliefs are mere fetishes. But this conversation is not about victimhood. This conversation is about our agency, that we are not what they said about us. This conversation is about redemption based on 3 anchors. Number 1, memory. That the one thing you do is you assume a cow or a horse that you used to plow has no memory of the whip you placed on its back and of the cruelty you did to it yesterday. We're not horses, we're not cattle. We're human beings. And we have a right to memory because memory is a terrain of struggle. Jewish people were deemed entitled to memory for the Holocaust, and today nobody ever tells them it happened too long ago. Today, on a particular day called the Day of Remembrance, the British wear a red poppy in remembrance of their heroes who fell when? A long time ago. About the time when the genocide against the Herero and the Nama was happening, about the time when they were hanging Nehanda, Nyikasikan, around the time when they were carrying out the atrocities against the Mau Mau. It may be a long time for others, but we live in a generation which, because of alienation and dispossession, is entitled to say, we owe ourselves the duty to heal from our own wounds. We owe ourselves the duty to hold our own dictators to account, but we will not allow you to try and construct political amnesia and erasure of your own contribution to the dysfunctions in the society we live in. When the British, the Dutch, the Spanish committed genocide and crimes here on the continent, they had not been established Spanish states, Dutch states, German states. It was before, for some of them, 1884 Berlin, or even after Berlin, they had not achieved de facto control of the territory. That's why there was resistance. You cannot insist that we apply the law of the offender. So we have to ask ourselves, what were the indigenous law requirements for the sort of atrocities? Lawyers, please, wake up. Do not accept this racialized anchorage of our law, where you say, okay, the law of the native is not general law, the law of the native is localized law, it's not international law. What you were doing was not international law, and I will come to it to demonstrate how the acts done against colonized people, the acts done against those under apartheid and enslaved people were acts done in violation of what was law at the time. I don't have time to go into the statistics of why people who look like most of you in this room are the highest population of imprisoned people in the world. Remember what Hegel says, the native is in everything but vice, an infant. So this criminalization of black identity explains why people panic when you walk into a shop. We know that between 12 to 20 million Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas across the Atlantic between 1501 and 1866. That more than 2 million died during the Middle Passage due to disease, malnutrition, brutal treatment. That millions more died on the plantations. But here is the irony. When there was a move to abolish slavery or enslavement or chattel enslavement, in Barbados in 1833, the British slave owners received 20 million pounds, which would be the equivalent of anything between 17 to 100 billion now in today's currency, in compensation for the loss of their property. The enslaved people had to pay almost the same amount for their liberation. How? By rendering free work to their slave. Free, but working for free. Now, I want you to understand the continuity of this. When decolonization happened, all countries that acquired freedom were required to pay fair and adequate compensation for land that had been taken from their ancestors to those that had taken the land without paying any compensation. Those who had received free labor from them were required to be paid. How? From the taxation of the now politically independent. The Africa Development Bank 2020 report says 6 trillion was estimated wealth stolen from Africa during colonization. If you are thinking about what I referred to, the genocide against the Ere and the Nama, 1904 to 1908, which was extermination camps, and the sort of things you saw later on in 1945 in the Holocaust. King Leopold's reign, 1885 to 1908. Belgians' exploitation of the Congo led to the deaths of 10 to 15 million people who were in forced labor, mutilation and mass killings, including chopping of limbs. If you are in this room and you want to tell me that 1908 is so far, too long ago for you to remember the loss of 10 to 15 million African lives, why do we remember the First World War? But some people were exiled and others had their heads decapitated, including Chief Chingaira from Zimbabwe and others whose heads were taken to the British museums and remain there today. And the British say they can't return because their laws do not allow the return of human remains. But there were others who were assassinated. Thomas Sankara, Samora Machel, Walter Rodney, Bantu Steve Biko, Amilcar Cabral, and the list is long. You think assassination and exile was the worst thing? As late as 1958, there were human zoos in Europe, in Belgium, and in Paris, where they kept black children in those zoos. The last one, 1958, and in Germany and in the United States. And throughout this period of decolonization demands, the only real significant payment made by former colonizers in Africa was 19.9 million to survivors of British colonial abuses, the so-called Mau Mau reparations case in 2013. You think the atrocities are just this individual, human, and community? The French approach to this in Haiti and Francophone Africa was to tether those countries to the CFA franc. 50% of foreign reserves of the franc countries were required to be held in the French treasury, limiting their ability to invest in their own economies. French companies and investors benefited disproportionately as profit repatriation was made easy, leading to capital flight, or what we now call illicit financial flows. So the exploitation of African natural resources, the exploitation of DRC's coltan and cobalt and other materials are something that is part of the continuities from enslavement to colonization to apartheid. But the global reparations claims and their precedents for other communities that have not disputed are the Jewish Holocaust reparations, where Germany paid $90 billion to Holocaust survivors and Israel. Comfort women in Asia, Japan issued official apologies and compensation to South Korean and Filipino women forced into sexual slavery during World War II. I hope I have said to you that anchoring a particular supremacist view and creating a logic that enabled people who had been enslaved, colonized, and lived in apartheid to accept their own inferiority, their own infantilization, their own fragmentation, was actually part of the great erasure. It was racialized. It targeted particular racial group, the Africans. So not only were you economically disadvantaged, physically and psychologically punished, you were socially ostracized. They said black people, Africans, are dirty. And yet it is Africans and black people who were their nannies, looking after their children, feeding them, teaching them to walk, to talk, and to write. They said black people or Africans were dishonest. Yet it is these same people that got on their plantations to do all the work and to account. They said you were lazy, and yet I do not recall any mine that sent thousands of white people under the mine in South Africa, in the Congo, or elsewhere. How did lazy people, for free, produce so much wealth that built the comfort for which our people are being asked to be grateful? Achieving reparations for Afro-descendants, for the global Pan-African family, requires a robust institutional framework, ensuring that the 5 pillars of reparations, non-recurrence, compensation, restitution, satisfaction, and I could go on. You need an institutional framework. And that institutional framework needs to realize there will be opposition. That opposition will be mounted epistemically, ideologically. That opposition will be mounted economically. That opposition will be mounted by targeting individuals. That opposition will seek to find black bodies, as it did with people who we now wrongly call Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom wasn't actually as bad as the people that we call Uncle Toms. But we find Uncle Toms as the main voices for saying you don't need reparations. Just do not be corrupt. Now, President Mbeki did the illicit financial flows high-level report, which showed that the bleeding of Africa by corruption accounts for 5% of what Africa loses. That Crime, proceeds from crime, account for another minuscule percentage. But the majority, over 80%, is from illicit financial flows. Part of them arise out of the structures that were set up during colonization and apartheid to enable big capital to move capital without accountability to its local environs. All the communities from which mines extracted remain under development, remain vulnerable, food insecure. Communities from which people were evicted. It is not an anti-white crusade. It is not even necessarily an anti-capital crusade. It is simply saying some people were taken as prisoners of war. Some people were forcibly conscripted. Some people were raided. Some people were put in concentration camps. But what is not disputed is how they were moved from productive land into non-arable land, which is disease-infested. That those people are entitled to produce. The fact that there are Africans in this room who graduated cum laude from their universities, coming from tribal trust lands or rural areas, should not create the mythology that you do not need reparations. That all the African needs to do is work harder, be less lazy, less corrupt, as though global systemic structural anti-black racism was purely a matter of ethics. It was about constructing structures of exploitation. And this is my parting story for you. A wealthy man gives his 18-year-old son, who has a provisional driver's license, not yet a license, his expensive Mercedes-Benz. The young man gets drunk, drives very fast down the streets, knocks down a family, a man, his wife, and several kids. The wife and the husband die. They were the breadwinners of the family. But as happened, the man, his wife, and kids were not crossing at the designated crossing point. They were doing what Americans call jaywalking. Tell me that we will all just come and say you were jaywalking. This man who was driving without a license, drunken driving, driving fast, is not responsible, because had you been crossing at the designated crossing point, you would not have died. Would we say that to Ukrainians? Would we say that to Jewish people? Would we say that to Korean people, that, look, this thing is about your own fault. You ought to have behaved differently. The bill I gave you, the financial bill, and what Africa has received by way of aid and development assistance since 1947 does not come to 5% what Africa lost during colonization. And isn't it strange that the mathematical problem does not arise when Sudan is being asked to pay $300 million for the bombing of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam by terrorists? How is this money paid? By Sudanese taxpayers. Did Sudanese taxpayers bomb Dar es Salaam and Nairobi? As tragic as those incidents were. How come there is never a mathematical question that says you can't ask Sudanese to pay because they were not the individual terrorists? How is a whole country responsible for the single, when the Libyans are being asked to pay for the Pan Am Air bombing? How come you don't say, how are you going to calculate? How are you going to establish the causal linkage between the people of Libya and those who planted the bomb? Arithmetics only, or mathematics, becomes a problem when black bodies require to be recognized for repair. And that should tell you it is a racialized conversation. We must not pretend.
I'm a king, yes. I'm a king, go. I think I'm a king, go.